I want to read a verse to you tonight that is, of course, very familiar to you, and I may emphasize it a wee bit differently than you're used to. So don't brace yourself, because it has to do with fire and affliction. So don't. We're going to go a little bit different direction. In Revelation chapter 17 and verse 14, it says, "These shall make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb shall overcome them, for he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and they that are with him are called and chosen and faithful." And that is a verse that's very familiar to us. We can correlate that to outer court, holy place, holy of holies. We can relate that to children, young men, and fathers. We can do a lot of those things. But I want to look at one particular, one of these words in particular. And I don't want to look at it in the sense that, brace yourself, folks, we're about to suffer. I want to look at it in the sense of God really comes to meet with his people in the fire. It's a place that God comes and reveals himself to his people in a fresh way. Just today I discovered that there was in June 1st of 2010, there was a rocket that was sent into outer space, and it was sent to a very specific location, and its entire mission was for 10 years, 10 years. It's not that I'm getting emotional, I just need to clear my throat. For 10 years, it's to sit in one spot and take a snapshot of the sun every day for 10 years. And so before service tonight, I watched about 15 minutes of a 48-minute video where every second represents one day of the rotation around the sun. I mean, as this satellite was taking snapshots from the same picture and was going around the sun. But the thing that struck me was this. It's an extraordinary image. It really is very, very fascinating. And as I'm looking at it, I'm thinking to myself, as a young man, we were warned not to look at the sun because it's going to hurt your eyes, right? And that's true. And during an eclipse, it can actually destroy. Oh, thank you. There's that little reward. Glass of water in heaven. A little crown, a little jewel. Hallelujah. So we have an unprecedented revelation of the sun that could never have been viewed before. They use special filters and special lenses, and you can watch the sun, and it's an extraordinarily vibrant place. You wouldn't want to be on the surface, of course. But as I'm watching it, I thought to myself, in our days, there's a greater revelation of the sun than we've ever seen before. First the natural, then the spiritual. And so in the midst of our afflictions and in the midst of our trials, as we know, we are chosen in the furnace of affliction. There's no revelation there. But the part that I want to emphasize is this, is that in our afflictions, we should be looking for a greater revelation of the Son. That's how it works. That's how it was meant to work. God never intended to forsake us. God never intended to leave us to suffer alone. But rather, in the midst of the affliction, God wants to reveal himself to us. And we'll look at an illustration tonight, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and there was no greater revelation that they could have possibly had than when they were in the furnace. The Son revealed himself to them in the furnace. And so it is a burden on my heart, and has been as long as I've been a believer, even before I was introduced to this church from the very beginning of my experience with the Lord and walk with the Lord. It's been my desire to not only come to know the Son in a better way, but it gives me great joy to see God's people have revelations. I'm always anxious. I always tell Becky, we sit down and we have prayer time. I say, tell me what God's been speaking to you. And she shares things with me and my mouth is just gaping, and I'm thinking, oh, that's really good. That's really good. We take great joy as the Son reveals himself, and as people share what God has revealed of himself, there's joy. So the part that I want to emphasize is the chosen part, the chosen part, the chosen part. Isaiah 48 verse 10, again familiar to us. I have refined thee, but not with silver. I have chosen thee in the furnace of affliction. And by the end of this message, we hope to understand why it is so. Why is it so that's the place that God chooses to choose us, where God decides to choose us. Now, I want to turn our attention for our main text tonight to the book of Daniel, and I want to go through this little episode with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And I don't want to look at it in the sense of a charming, Sunday school story, but I want to look at it in terms of serious doctrinal ramifications, serious revelation about how God meets with His people and where God meets with His people. There's nothing worse than going through the midst of a trial and feeling like you're all alone. There's nothing worse than that. I remember when I was in Penyan, and there were all kinds of pressures that were coming to bear and criticisms that were coming to bear, and people were leaving the church, and it was just an awful time in my life, just an awful time. And proud and happy to be in the ministry, to be used of God in any way possible, but this sense that things were slipping away and that I was failing at my task. And it was a lonely, horrible feeling and it was something that God put me in. And there were no comforters. There were no comforters. I couldn't possibly have sat down with somebody and explained to them what was going on in a way that they could have entered into it with me. It was not possible. Sometimes you just have to go through things alone. And I went out for a walk. Sleep was futile. I lost 15, 20 pounds. Since then regained it. But, and the stress was literally killing me. That's what the doctor said. He said, I don't know what's going on in your life, Mr. Anderson, but whatever it is, it's killing you. And so I go out for a walk. It was about 3 o'clock in the morning. And some way into the walk, I collapsed. I was emaciated. I was famished. I was, I just couldn't take it anymore. And I just collapsed in the middle of the street. And, like those before me, I prayed the prayers that some of people have prayed and said, Lord, please take me. But then I remembered my girls, and I said, no, I retract that prayer. I've got a responsibility to raise those girls. But as I was laying there in the street, and I was in the middle of the street, thank God it was in the middle of the night, and it was in a rural area, there were no cars. But I laid there for some time, and as I did, God opened up my eyes, and I saw the peacefulness of the throne of God. I saw it in the trees. I saw in the midst of my fire, I saw the Son of God, and everything was going to be okay. It didn't change the trial. I still had to go through. I still was in the fire, and nothing changed actually for quite a while. And when it did change, it got worse. But there's something to be encouraged about. But the point is this. I don't know that I've ever in my life felt forsaken because of that. I saw him in the trees, his throne. The trees was the backdrops, but I saw his throne, and I saw him sitting on his throne, and he was the image of peace. And I thought to myself, no matter what's going on in my life right now, there's peace in the world. There's a peace in heaven. There's peace. God has peace. If I could just enter into that, if I could just touch that. And so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is an excellent story because we read it and it's very victorious and we're excited because we know what's going to happen in the end. But it wasn't like that for them. They didn't know what was coming. They had no idea. In fact, their address to the king is, hey, if God wants to deliver us, He will. But if He chooses not to, we're okay with that as well. They didn't know what the outcome was going to be. And that's an important part of the story that you can't neglect. They didn't know what the outcome was going to be. They didn't know. So I want to pick up the narrative in Daniel chapter 3, verse 17. We will be, of course, excluding some of this because we want to be conscious of the time here. But in verse 17, we pick up the narrative here where it says, if it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace. So there was a demand that they bow, or they were going to be thrown into the furnace. And He will deliver us out of thy hand, O king. Verse 18. But if not, be known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. Now, I want to draw something from this. The enemy is far more interested in diverting us off the right path than he is in destroying us. You've got to know that. You've got to know this. You've got to understand this. The enemy is looking to get people to compromise, He's looking to get people to curse God and die. We'll look at Job in a minute. He's looking for people to deviate off the path so they disqualify themselves. And in a sense, he's interested in that more than he is in destroying us. In the sense here that they're thrown into a fiery furnace. The enemy is interested in getting us to turn off the path. And anyone who's been in the kingdom for any period of time knows that when God loses people, in many cases he loses them in the fire because they become disillusioned. And they become downcast, and they can't recover from it. I remember taking a brother out one time, and I said, "Brother, God still loves you." And he couldn't forgive himself. He couldn't get past that. He couldn't see the light of day. He couldn't get out of it, and, was diverted from the path. See, the enemy brings pressures to bear because he wants us to do things out of character. He wants us to divert from the path. He wants us to compromise. He wants all of that to take place. And so he brings pressure to bear. And so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego have an ultimatum. If you bow, like you haven't done, if you bow and you compromise, I'll spare your life. And they said, we're not going to bow, and if God doesn't deliver us from the fiery furnace, we'll take that fate rather than submitting to idolatry. I've observed this in mankind, I guess I will say it that way. I've observed this, that the enemy knows what men are made of, and given the right pressure and the right heat, they will compromise. It's in all of us. I'm not criticizing any particular group of men or women. It's in all of us. And we really need the grace of God not to do that. We really need God to put something into our spirits that says, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to compromise. I'm not going to go down that road. And if it costs me my life, I'm not going down that road. Now, hopefully, it's not going to come to that. In Job chapter 1, verse 11, the enemy says this to God, "But put forth thine hand now, and touch all that he hath, and he will curse thee to thy face." Now, why would he say such a thing? Do you think this was just a spontaneous thing that Satan said? You know why he said that? Because generally speaking, it's true. Generally speaking, it's true. And he knew it. But God knew there was something different in Job, and that he wouldn't bend to that. I have an inkling in my mind that the enemy was surprised that Job didn't do that. Because most men do, is what he was saying. In chapter 2, verses 4 through 5, "And Satan answered the Lord and said, Skin for skin, yea, all that a man hath will he give for his life. But put forth thine hand now and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse thee to thy face." If you let me put this pressure on him, God, I'll get him to divert off the path. I'll get him to take another path. And that's what the enemy's interested in, is to get us to step out of line, to get us to take a different path, to get us to compromise, the standards that God has given to us. Now, there are many things in this world for which compromise preserves life, okay? Let me just put that out there. Let me give you an example. It's a little bit out there, but it's still an example of where life could be preserved through a compromise. Two women come before Solomon, right? They both claim that the baby is theirs. The one wants to divide the baby, and the mother, who has every right to that child, compromises and says, "No, spare the child's life." So for the sake of preservation, for the sake of life, for the sake of peace, certain compromises can be made because it preserves life. But this isn't that type of compromise. This is the type of compromise where the king says to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, "You either pick another course, or I'm going to burn you up." And they say, "Then let the fire start. Let the fires burn." Now, they didn't know what we're going to find out and what we already know, and that is that the Son of God was going to meet them. In actuality, the fire that the enemy determined to destroy them is the very fire that's going to liberate them. Is the very fire that's going to liberate them. It's the very fire that is going to set them free. Sometimes we have to have the right ideas concerning fire. I'm going to a chiropractor now because my decrepit structure has taken enough and it's time to get things straightened out. And so this is what my chiropractor says. He says, "It's going to hurt at first." Well, thank you. I kind of knew that already, but the thing is this here. But he said, "You've got to look beyond that." You've got to look beyond it. We're bringing things into alignment. We're taking things that were off-centered for a long time, bring them into alignment. And he was right. Oh, he was right. It hurt. And it still does. But the thing is this here, we have to look at the pain correctly. The pain is fixing something. So we come into a fiery trial. We come into straits, right? Is it to destroy us? Or is the Son of God going to reveal himself to us in a special way? And will we come out of it with the cords broken in our life? So, as you can imagine, Nebuchadnezzar was very impressed with these fellows, right? They defied him, and he was very impressed. Not really. He was furious. He was furious. If you take a stand for righteousness, by the way, expect the mob to not like you very much. Expect the mob to not like you. So in verse 19 of Daniel chapter 3, it says, Then was Nebuchadnezzar full of fury, and the form of his visage was changed. I mean, he went apoplectic. He's having seizures here. Against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, therefore he spake and commanded that they should heat the furnace 7 times more than it was wont to be heated. So here we have, let me put this in context for you. Here we have the servants of God on a mission from God, standing for God. And what happens? The fire gets hotter. I'm not laughing because it's funny. I'm laughing at the irony of it all. For their stand for God, the fire gets hotter. Have you ever been in that situation? But you told me to do this. You told me to do this. And ever since I've done it, it's got worse. How does that work? Well, keep in mind, if we go through the fire with the right attitude of heart, we come out the other side with our bondages broken, with the chains that bind us broken. And we've got to keep that in mind. So every man or woman who determines not to compromise or remain righteous will face the fury of the leader, face the fury of the crowd, face the fury of the mob, face the fury of the adversary. Verse 21, Then these men were bound in their coats, their hosen, and their hats, and their other garments, and were cast into the midst of the fiery furnace. Therefore, because the king's commandment was so urgent, and the furnace exceedingly hot, the flame of the fire slew those men that took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Let me stop here for a moment again. How do you think that made these guys feel? They see other people perish from the fire, and they're about to go into that same fire. And you know what you'll find that will discourage your heart, but don't let it? You'll find other people who've been burned. You'll find other people who didn't survive the fire. And they'll give you all kinds of advice. They'll give you all kinds of reasons and whys and wherefore as to why you need to choose another path and why you need to preserve yourself through compromise. And so here these 3 men are about to be thrown into the fire, and they see men before them perishing by the fire. And I'm not going to lie to you, you already know that it's true. Throughout the ages, the halls of Christianity are littered with people who've been destroyed by the fire. And you can't let that get on your insides. You can't let that affect your decisions. You can't let that affect how you view things. Because we still have the example of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We still have the example of those who survived the fire. Not only did they survive it, but they came out free men. Here's something else that I want you to observe. They looked like they lost. They defied the king. The king was furious, heated up the furnace. The men that took them there perished. And then here goes Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego tripping and falling down into the midst of the fire in front of the whole crowd. And they looked like failures. They looked like failures. They looked like, well, you should have compromised. You should have backed off a little bit. Should have taken another course. Should have lit that fire yourself and got out of that trouble, like Isaiah chapter 50 verse 10 says. Make sparks for yourself, kind of thing. But whatever God has told you to do, you hold the course. You stand fast. You keep going forward. Though the fire gets hot, though you see 10,000 fall at thy side and 1,000 at thy right hand, or maybe I got that reversed. We'll check that out later. But you understand the idea from the Psalms. The flames of fire slew the men that took them up there, and sometimes it can be disheartening to see others who have been consumed by fire. You know something? I was talking to somebody recently. I don't remember who it was, actually. This last couple of weeks, I've talked to so many people that are going through fires. So many people. It's almost like every time I turn around. But at one point I said this. I said, you know, the only thing that matters in this world is what God spoke to you. Really, it's the only thing that matters. At the end of the day, life really is that simple. It really is. It really, really is that simple. And somehow, you know, we have to cast off the whys and the wherefores and just simply say, I have this faith in my heart. I know what God has spoken. Because you see people falling to the left, you see people falling to the right, and it can be disheartening. But we've got to hold fast to what God has spoken. But then there's something that happens, okay? And this only happens for those that get thrown into the furnace, by the way. This only happens to those that God is qualifying and choosing. What happened is God showed up. You know, I have experienced this a few times in my life where God shows up. God shows up. I have, as I'm sure you have as well, I'm not saying anything unique about what I've experienced, but I have at times in the midst of my fires found the grace to actually laugh and say, can't make this stuff up. And the grace, you know, to see God working in the midst of the fire and have peace, even in the midst of the fire. Now, you still have to go through the fire, right? You still have to experience it. But oh, God shows up. Where does God meet with His people? In the fire. I was talking to Rebecca recently, and we were sharing some thoughts. And I said, you know what, Rebecca? If I did an analysis of my life, and I wanted to chart the things that God spoke to me and the profundity of them, or how much of an impact they had on me, on a bar graph, on a scale. If I picked the most profound things that God ever spoke to me in my life, life-changing things that produced faith and life and victory, the most profound things that God spoke to me in my life, they would completely and totally correlate with fires. They would correlate with fires. And so, in Daniel chapter 3, verse 24, God shows up. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astonished, and rose up in haste, and spake, and said unto his counselors, Did not we cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire? They answered and said unto the king, True, O king. Verse 25, he answered and said, Lo, I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they have no hurt, and the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. Now I got to tell you something. That must have been a very profound revelation for this heathen king to know there was something unique about that 4th man. That he likened that 4th man to the Son of God. The Son of God. So, where does God want to meet with us? You know, we can feel, I'm not excluding myself from this, we can feel so abandoned in the fire. We can feel so abandoned. We can feel like, hello, do you even know I'm here? Everybody experiences that. But what I'm saying is, in your mind and in your heart, grab hold of this, that God meets with His people in the fire. God meets with His people in the fire. And the result of this episode in the life of these 3 men, the result of it was liberty and freedom and honor that eventually came to them. I want to draw your attention to verse 25 here, where it says, I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire. They have no hurt, and the form is like the Son of God. Let me jump from that verse to Isaiah 43, verses 1 and 2, for confirmation on what we just read there. In Isaiah 43, verses 1 and 2, it says, But now thus saith the Lord that created thee, O Jacob, and he that formed thee, O Israel, fear not, for I have redeemed thee, I have called thee by name, thou art mine. And I feel that the Lord would say that to each and every one of you tonight. Thou art mine. You're not like other men. You're not like other women. You're called by my name. Thou art mine. Verse 2, When thou passest through the waters, I will be with thee. And though the rivers, they shall not overflow thee. When thou walkest through the fire, thou shalt not be burned, neither shall the flame kindle upon thee. Where does God meet with his people? Where does God reveal himself to his people? In the midst of the fire. What should we expect as we come into the fire? Well, we should expect a supper. We're not getting away from that. But we should expect that as we come out of the fire, or perhaps even in the midst of the fire, that God is going to reveal himself. Now listen to me. Listen very carefully. And I know you guys know these things, but I just feel so powerfully up here tonight. God wants to reveal himself to us in a fresh way in the fire. He does. He wants to reveal himself to us in a fresh way in the fire. How could Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego experience what they experienced unless it was in the furnace? The loosing of their bondages, the revelation of the Son of God in the fiery furnace. Isaiah 43 says, the flame will not cause you to be singed, neither will be the smell of smoke on their garments. Something else happened that I want to draw your attention to. What else happened? At one point, everybody sneered at them. At one point, everybody thought they were fools. At one point, everybody thought you should have chosen another course. You should have preserved your life. You should have compromised. You should have done this. You should have done the other. You should have bowed. Now you failed. You've been thrown into the furnace. But now the tables are turned. Because in front of the entire crowd, God vindicates them. Now don't dismiss that. Don't dismiss that. Sometimes you look like a fool. Sometimes you look like, you made a bad decision there. But eventually it always turns around. Eventually God always vindicates. God always brings us out, and God always vindicates. If you go into the fire because God has put you there, and you remain faithful in the fire, and you don't compromise, God will put his honor on you. And everybody will see it. Everybody will see it. Now, if I'm perfectly honest, I don't know whether they'll see it in this life or in the life to come, but rest assured, everyone's going to know. Everyone's going to know. I was in a situation myself, and I was being, I was just being persecuted, I guess. I'm not really quite sure the right word to say, but it was very uncomfortable. And, I got an encouraging verse from Pastor Bailey at the time. It looked like I was the baddie. It looked like I was, the bad guy and everything else. And all I was doing was trying to be faithful. And I was in the midst of a fire. And Pastor Bailey sent me this verse in Isaiah chapter 54, verse 17. He said, no weapon that is formed against thee shall prosper, and every tongue that shall rise against thee in judgment thou shalt condemn. This is the heritage of the servants of the Lord, and their righteousness is of me, saith the Lord. Eventually, God tells all. If a person has been a miscreant, if a person has misbehaved, if a person has compromised, if a person has gotten off the course, if a person has, chosen the wrong path, eventually everyone knows. But for those who've been faithful, even though it caused them to go through a fire, even though it caused them to go through a furnace, everybody knows. I remember this young lady when I was in high school. I remember this, she was a Christian, and I don't know what faith she was of back then. I wasn't really a Christian myself, actually, until my senior year. But I knew something about this girl. People laughed at her and people picked on her and everything else, but I knew that she was a Christian. And, she had peace on her countenance, and she was a good girl. And I remember thinking to myself, you know what? You guys that are all laughing and sneering, you're going to leave this place and you're going to mess up your lives. Every one of you is going to go out and mess up your lives. But this girl, she's going to have honor. And you know what she did? Eventually she did. And eventually everybody recognized, that she made the right choices. Eventually everybody knows. Eventually everybody knows. And so here, Nebuchadnezzar now is forced to acknowledge that God was in Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Eventually the entire kingdom realized that these men that went into this fiery furnace were special, something very special in their lives. So I want to bring this little exhortation to a close. I don't know if I can call it little anymore. I wasn't paying attention at the time, but what happens to the righteous in the fire? Or let me put it another way. What should be our expectation of our fire? What should be our expectation? What should be our expectation? Our expectation should be, first and foremost, that if we determine not to compromise, if we determine to stay on the course, that God will meet us. God will be in that furnace with us. We have an unprecedented revelation of the sun today that when I was a boy didn't exist. Couldn't look at the sun that way. And now I can sit for 48 minutes and watch the sun, see every flare, see every crater, see every explosion, see every flash in a beautiful, technicolor. We have a greater revelation of the sun in our solar system than we ever have before. And first the natural, then the spiritual. In the days in which we are coming into, we need to believe God for a greater revelation of the sun, a greater revelation of the sun. Why, in conclusion here, why are we chosen in the fire of affliction? Why is it that God chooses us in the furnace of affliction? Why is it that way? Well, I would summarize it this way. I would say, just like God spoke to the children of Israel concerning the wilderness, that He took them to the wilderness to humble them, to prove them, to see what was in their heart, whether they would serve God or no. And that's an apt description of why God chooses people in the furnace. They come into a situation and God tests them. There are always options. The enemy makes sure that there are always options. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, all you got to do is bow, and we'll take you away from this. Even, in the temptation of Christ, the enemy always gave him an option to end the temptation. And so God takes us through the furnace of affliction to see what we're going to do. Are we going to stay the course? Are we going to be offended? Are we going to be knocked off course? Or are we going to stay on the course, even if it means a fire? And so I want to end with Isaiah 43 verse 2. When thou passest through the waters, I will be with thee, and through the rivers, they shall not overflow thee. When thou walkest through the fire, thou shalt not be burned, neither shall the flame kindle upon thee. If we choose not to compromise, if we choose to stay the course, if we don't take that other option and stay on course, yes, there may be a fire involved, but there's going to be a greater revelation of God in that fire, and there's also going to be the honor that's bestowed upon those who don't compromise, and it's going to be an honor that everybody recognizes. It's going to be an honor that everybody sees. Today in the church, it is almost as though compromise is their middle name. And there are groups of people throughout the world, we're not the only ones, groups of people throughout the world that are not bending and bowing. And they're small groups. And, maybe they're sneered on by the bulk of Christians. Maybe they're, saying you're making your lives more hard than it needs to be, just compromise. But for those who go on that path, well, they'll make very little impact in this world. And they'll make even less in the world to come. But for those, that don't compromise, that stay true to the message, that don't take the options that the enemy gives to them, there's going to be a revelation of the Son, and then there's going to be the honor that comes upon those who don't compromise. Amen.